Good evening. Welcome to the brave new world of Donald J. Trump, President-elect of the United States of America. His new head of strategy is accused in America of giving cover to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and white supremacists, allegations he denies. But what does his appointment say about the presidency to come? Here, Mrs. May struggles to work out how to re-establish a special relationship with the United States after UKIP's Nigel Farage claims ownership.
Also on tonight's programme, as scientists warn this year is very likely to be the warmest on record. Can world leaders protect the planet from the climate change denier now heading for the White House? The Labour MP Jo Cox was murdered by a man motivated by politics or ideology. The opening day of her killer's trial is told. And we have two investigations tonight on vulnerable teenage girls. We report on the children who go missing from care and talk to one young woman enslaved and abused in the UK after being trafficked from West Africa. And we hear from one woman and her daughters about growing up in a home shattered by domestic violence.
You know, the incidents ranged from sort of pushing, you know, right through to being bitten, punched, stabbed. I had a plastic bag put over my head.
Plus, closer, brighter, bigger, all eyes tonight upward for tonight's supermoon. What does it all foretell? A new political tone and landscape is now being set in the United States as Donald Trump starts to build his team. And the messages he's sending, perhaps not surprisingly, are mixed and controversial. His chief strategist is to be Stephen Bannon, who used to run the anti-establishment Breitbart News network, infamous for its hard-right support. The appointment led Mr. Trump's new chief of staff, the prominent and experienced Republican Reince Priebus, to make defending Mr. Bannon his first priority. Kylie Morris is in Washington. Kylie.
Well, John, if President-elect Trump wanted to make a splash with this first appointment, he's certainly done that. The appointment of Steve Bannon and Reince Priebus speak to kind of both sides, really, of the Trump campaign. Reince Priebus is, of course, he is a Republican insider. He is part of the establishment. Many people within the Republican Party here will be comforted by the idea that he will have the ear of Donald Trump. But on the other hand, you have Steve Bannon, as you mentioned, much more linked to the radical right here. And certainly there are concerns, even though Steve Bannon denies any suggestion that he himself is anti-Semitic or that he holds any homophobic, Islamophobic kind of views, there are fears that those who attach themselves to the Trump campaign, some of them via the Breitbart website, who have those kinds of attitudes, that for them, this appointment will effectively speak as code, that their ideas, having existed on the fringes, on the very margins of the American political system for many years, that those ideas are now being taken inside the Trump presidency and inside the White House. We did hear Trump appear last night. He did a 60 Minutes interview, an extended interview, sitting down with his family, speaking to some of the issues. And you can see already that he's walking a bit of a tightrope. He's trying, obviously, to still speak to the kind of campaign promises he made about expelling 11 million illegal immigrants, about cracking down on protests, for example. But at the same time, he is making an effort, it would seem, to, if not dilute that, at least create some space around those ideas. So he's talking now about, instead of 11 million, perhaps sending 2 million illegal immigrants back just to begin with. So he is really, I suppose, carrying out a bit of a balancing act at the moment. And certainly that's what we've seen, I think, with the appointment of Steve Bannon. The elevation of provocateur Steve Bannon to become Donald Trump's strategist puts the former editor of a website he described as a platform for the alt-right at the heart of American power. Flicking through Breitbart headlines serves as a helpful aide-memoir of what the alt-right is. Misogynistic.
Would you rather your child had feminism or cancer?
Anti-Semitic.
Bill Kristol, Republican spoiler, renegade Jew.
Anti-Muslim.
This divisive attitude has no business being in the White House.
When Steve Bannon was first appointed as Trump's campaign CEO, Hillary Clinton described it like this.
White supremacists now call themselves white nationalists. The paranoid fringe now calls itself alt-right. But the hate burns just as bright.
Today, in the shimmering lobby of Trump Tower, They were defending Steve Bannon's appointment.
I work very closely with Steve Bannon. He's been the general of this campaign, and frankly, people should look at the full resume.
Steve Bannon's first job was aboard a Navy destroyer deployed to the Persian Gulf for the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979. Back on land, he found a place at Harvard. Then it was Goldman Sachs, before he opened his own firm. He ended up with a stake in Seinfeld and exec produced a handful of Hollywood films. In 2012, Steve Bannon took over Breitbart, then in August, Donald Trump's campaign. His influence was quickly evident, driving baseless speculation about Hillary Clinton's health.
And I'm not saying that, she's had a stroke or anything like that, but this is not the woman that we're used to seeing.
You can see him smiling at the Facebook Live that Trump staged before the second presidential debate with 3 women who accused Bill Clinton of sexual abuse. His appointment has exacerbated fears that the next president will give succor to extremist supporters from within the walls of the White House. An Ohio GOP strategist wrote,
"The racist, fascist, extreme right is represented footsteps from the Oval Office. Be very vigilant, America."
Steve Bannon coming into the White House, being steps away from the Oval Office, being perhaps the number 1 or 2 advisor to the President of the United States is a very ill omen for those of us who care about fairness and justice and equality in this country.
Alongside the ultimate outsider in the White House will be the insider Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, chair of the Republican National Committee, who defended Bannon's appointment.
I find him not to be the way that he's being accused. I find him to be the opposite, and I think people need to give people time and give people an opportunity and not make judgments. Don't judge people based on what other people say.
Last night, President-elect Trump appeared, as presidents-elect do, on America's 60 Minutes. Flanked by the future First Family, he responded loosely to questions over key policies he announced during his presidential campaign. While he advocated a judicial undoing of abortion protections for women, he seemed to accept same-sex marriage.
Do you support marriage equality?
It's irrelevant because it was already settled. It's law. It was settled in the Supreme Court. I mean, it's done.
As for the wall with Mexico, well, it might become a fence. Told of the wave of hate crimes that have followed the election, he seemed surprised.
Muslims.
I am so saddened to hear that, and I say stop it. If it helps, I will say this, and I'll say it right to the camera, stop it.
Either he is not paying attention to the news or he is not telling the truth about what he knows. And the reality is there are a lot of people in this country who are especially concerned that not just the Trump government, but all the people who are outside the Trump government but feel now empowered that their perspective is now the right one.
With this first appointment, the president-in-waiting has signaled he'll not be tamed by the White House. Donald Trump has the power to bend history to his will, and he intends to use it.
Well, now we're joined from Washington by the former presidential candidate Evan McMullin. He gained national and international recognition when he stood against Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton as an independent. Mr. McMullin, thank you for joining us. What's wrong with Steve Bannon?
Well, this is a man who has encouraged the white supremacist movement in the United States and through his publication, Breitbart, attacked people of different faiths, of different races. This is not the right signal that a president-elect wants to send to a country as diverse as the United States.
I mean, you're a conservative. You ran as a conservative, although an independent. What is it about Mr. Trump's arrival in the White House that gives you anxiety?
Well, I want to be very clear that after the election, I have said to my supporters, to my followers, that we should hope and even pray for people of faith that Donald Trump won't implement the policies that he's advocated for and the rhetoric that he advanced while he was on the campaign trail. And that includes everything from, say, calling Hispanics rapists and advocating for a national registry for Muslim Americans, for example. These kinds of things. We need to hope that Donald Trump actually won't follow through on those policies. If he doesn't, well, that'll be a good thing. And so we need to wait and see. But then when we see that he appoints someone like Steve Bannon, who has encouraged the white supremacist and the white nationalist movement in the United States, it doesn't bode well for the kinds of policies that he might actually pursue as president.
Well, now, you're somebody who's worked in the CIA for 11 years. And I'm just wondering, to what extent you have any anxiety, indeed whether any of your old colleagues would have a great anxiety about his perceived cozying up to Mr. Putin?
Well, I think it's more than perceived. I mean, you're talking about a man who hired a variety of people into his staff who have deep and even ongoing financial ties to the Kremlin and to oligarchs associated with Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has encouraged the nativist, white nationalist movement across Europe and now in the United States. The Russians work to undermine our democracy through hacking different computer systems during the election. Of course, it's a deep concern. It's a very, very deep concern. The question now is whether our Republican leaders, our other Republican leaders in Congress and elsewhere, will stand up and check Donald Trump when if he advances policies and rhetoric that are consistent with what he did during the election, if he continues his alignment with Vladimir Putin. Unfortunately, with Steve Bannon, we don't yet see, for example, any Republicans in elected office that I've seen yet standing to oppose that decision. That's where we need them to stand up. We need them to be a voice for liberty and equality in America if Donald Trump will not be.
Well, of course, you've made a fair number of allegations there, and of course they are, in a sense, only allegations, but they're allegations which may well cause people not to sleep easy. I'm just wondering specifically about NATO. I mean, is NATO safe in Mr. Trump's hands?
Well, if we believe what Trump has said during the election about pulling out of NATO or pulling our support from NATO or not doing as much to support the alliance, then yes, there is reason for concern. But again, let's see what he does. I mean, I think it's naive to assume that he wouldn't pursue policies similar to those that he advocated so strongly for during the election. But we also, left with the President-elect Trump, have nothing left but hope until he does something that could be destructive to the alliance. And then if he tries to, then we need to stand up and oppose him. But I think there is, yes, cause for concern. And I think all of us who understand the importance that NATO has in world peace and for the U.S. interests and security interests, yes, we need to be very attentive to the kinds of policies Donald Trump pursues or advocates for in the months ahead.
Do you believe the presidential candidates should be, perhaps, their records should be inspected by the intelligence services to see whether they are, in fact, as it were, safe?
Well, I do believe that it would be helpful if there was some sort of security process as a part of the election. But at the same time, the American people are those who choose the president, and that's where the power needs to rest. But there are things that have been traditional in United States presidential politics. For example, the declaration of one's tax returns, releasing one's tax documents so that people understand where their income is coming from and therefore what kinds of relationships they might have domestically or internationally. Donald Trump was elected president without ever having released his tax returns. So there's a lot about his relationships that we don't know, in addition to that which we do know, which is still quite a lot.
Well, Mr. McMullin, you came fifth, but you did well in your own state. You have to sort of recognize that Donald Trump's going to be the president of the United States. Should we give him a fair wind?
Well, with regard to the campaign, we ran a 3-month campaign funded by less than $1.5 million to stand up to Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, because otherwise there was no conservative voice, no one fighting for equality and liberty in the race. So that's what we did, and we were able to do amazing things. And again, just 3 months with limited funds. But yes, as I've said, any president deserves a chance to do the right thing, to pursue policies that will protect the constitutional rights, namely equality and liberty of American citizens. But Donald Trump has advocated for policies and advanced rhetoric the whole way through the campaign and even before the campaign that violate those principles, those ideals. So we should pray and hope that he doesn't advance those policies and that rhetoric as president, but we need to be ready to stand up and oppose them if he does, and we'll just see what happens. But Steve Bannon is not a good signal.
Evan McMullin, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Evan McMullin, the former presidential candidate in this campaign. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Now, the Prime Minister will make her first major foreign policy speech tonight at the Lord Mayor's banquet in the City of London. As such, it'll be her first opportunity to say how she expects to deal with Donald Trump's presidency. Already today, Number 10 has slapped down any suggestion that Nigel Farage could be used as a go-between. Well, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is at the Guildhall. Gary, what inklings are you getting on this speech?
Well, just to start with that image, and it is inevitably that image of Nigel Farage with Donald Trump is what has spurred all this thought about him being a go-between, and Nigel Farage himself saying he might be a go-between. Around Whitehall, people are saying they're not too concerned about the fact that he was first in the door. You can find people who are privately very concerned. What does it mean about a Donald Trump presidency? What are we learning by this sort of signal? Could he be picking up the phone to Nigel Farage in the future to check out his view on something? It was interesting that one American network captioned Nigel Farage the leader of the opposition in the UK. He's not even an MP. It could be argued, brought down the last Prime Minister. He doesn't, as it were, speak for Britain in international terms, but Donald Trump might think he does. All those sort of concerns are swirling around behind the scenes in Whitehall. In front of the scenes in the speech tonight, Theresa May is going to stick very much to the programme of government that she has been outlining, which is hug him close, the tradition of British-American relations. She's going to echo his concern for those people who've been left behind by globalisation. And as for that image of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage together, all of that they're saying in public, we're bigger than that, it doesn't matter.
Nigel Farage's dreams come true, Number 10's nightmare. And to rub their noses in his success, getting through the door to meet the President-elect first, Nigel Farage said Theresa May now needed him to mend bridges with Mr. Trump. He could provide introductions, help to mend fences after the abuse fired off at Mr. Trump by members of the government. A Number 10 spokesman pointed out that President-elect Trump had talked on the phone to Theresa May about hoping to repeat the Reagan-Thatcher relationship of the 1980s. The President-elect talked about enjoying the same relationship as Thatcher and Reagan. I don't recall there being any third person in that relationship, the spokesman said. A slapdown for any idea of Nigel Farage interposing himself between the two elected leaders.
Nigel Farage is a remarkable guy, and one can only pay tribute to his coup in being the first politician to see Mr. Trump. But both he and Mr. Trump essentially come from a celebrity background, and they had a very nice meeting. And I'm not trying to be rude or dismissive. I simply say that the Prime Minister doesn't need Nigel Farage.
Some Tory MPs think the new political age that Theresa May is speaking about this evening needs a more flexible approach.
I could quite easily see her picking up the phone to Nigel Farage and saying, come and have a whiskey and tell me all about what you know of Donald Trump to add to the picture that I'm building.
Number 10 is saying that's completely out of the question.
Well,
do you think they're missing an opportunity?
I think they're just missing an opportunity. The world's moved on, from this sort of entrenched position.
In Brussels, Boris Johnson joined an EU foreign ministers meeting that actually started last night, an emergency session to discuss President-elect Trump. Mr. Johnson refused to attend that session, saying he thought it was a misguided approach.
I think there's a lot to be positive about, and it's very important not to prejudge the President-elect or his administration. It's only a few days since the election has taken place. I think we all need to wait and see what they come up with, but I think we should regard it as a moment of opportunity.
Also in Brussels, the Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, carefully tailoring his message on NATO contributions to match what President-elect Trump has been saying.
The easiest and simplest reaction to a Trump presidency is for other European countries, some of them quite wealthy, to step up their own defence spending and to meet the 2% commitment. Britain does that already.
Britain's message to Europe: stop bashing Trump.
Really important, I think, to remember to think what that image of Donald Trump with Nigel Farage, what effect that image would have on the 27 countries that are staying inside the European Union. Nigel Farage, the man who's been wandering over to Europe, sneering at them for ages, snarling at them, telling them their project is misguided, and that's the first person who isn't an American politician that Donald Trump sees.
Gary at the Guildhall, thank you very much.
And later in tonight's programme, just how will Donald Trump react to news that the US has agreed to take in over 1,500 refugees being held on islands off Australia? And all eyes upward. Here's the view of tonight's supermoon from Ross on Wye. What does it mean for us all?
Now, 2016 is set to become the warmest year on record. Global temperatures so far are 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The data has been released as climate scientists meet in Morocco to push ahead with the detail of the historic Paris Climate Agreement. But that meeting has already been overshadowed by the president-elect Donald Trump's stated belief that global warming is a hoax and his vow to cancel the Paris deal shortly after he takes office. Our science editor Tom Clark reports.
Another year, another annual global climate jamboree. But this one in Marrakesh is like no other. Firstly, it's working to implement a new international law limiting carbon emissions signed in Paris last year. And second, it's taking place in the hottest year since records began. 2016 has seen dramatic and destructive weather across the globe. Hurricane Matthew killed more than 500 people when it tore through Haiti last month. The Yangtze Basin in China had its most significant summer floods since 1999, killing hundreds. As you'd expect from the hottest year, 2016 brought major heat waves. India, Kuwait, Iraq and Iran all recorded record temperatures well above 50 degrees. So it's no surprise that Canada experienced the costliest wildfire in its history. In May, more than 500,000 hectares of forest were destroyed.
Global temperatures are around 1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial. And that might not sound like a whole lot, but if you think about the last period of glaciation when large ice sheets covered much of North America and Northern Europe, going back 20,000 years ago, the globe was only, say, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius cooler.
That's why the principal aim of the climate talks is to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees.
It's time to keep the fossils in the ground.
And today, a bit of good news. Despite the world economy growing, carbon emissions have actually been stable for the last 3 years.
The big story here is China over the last decade. So during the 2000s, Chinese emissions were growing rapidly. No one expected Chinese emissions to grow so fast. And likewise, no one expected Chinese emissions to come to a sudden halt and even decline in the last few years.
It shows low carbon growth is possible, but we're still easily on track for more than 3 degrees of warming unless emissions start coming down, and fast. But across the optimism in Marrakesh now falls the shadow of Donald Trump.
We're going to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement and stop all payments of the United States tax dollars to UN global warming programs.
Awkward times for the current US climate negotiator. Under President Obama, America has driven this UN process forward.
I cannot speak for the President-elect's team or to their outlook on international climate policy. With the agreement having entered into force, it's no longer a question of whether to accelerate the agreement's implementation, but rather a question of when and how.
Will Mr. Trump really take the US back to the coal age? We just don't know. But last year in Paris, environmentalists celebrated the end of climate change denial. Now it's back with a vengeance.
So just how bad would a Trump presidency be for the environment? I'm joined from Washington by William Yateman of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Mr. Trump is tipped to appoint its energy and environment boss as head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And here in the studio, James Thornton, who's founder and CEO of the environmental law organisation Client Earth. William Yateman first. Donald Trump has described climate change as a hoax. Your boss, Myron Ebel, who is planning Mr. Trump's energy policy, was described by activists in Paris as a, quote, climate criminal wanted for destroying our future. Does anyone who is concerned about the planet need to be worried today?
Oh my, well, I mean, concerned about the planet comes in many forms, and indeed poverty reduction, I would say, is a more pressing priority. That's a belief shared not just by me and by Myron Ebell, although I can't speak to the transition at all. I don't know anything about that. But it's one shared by the American people. I mean, it's 22nd out of 22 priorities, according to Pew polling. Even among self-described liberals, it's the 6th most important priority. So really, is this a matter of this one president? I might add here that climate and energy was in no way an issue whatsoever in this election. I mean, you're putting a lot on his plate, I guess.
Okay.
So
well,
is it bad for the planet that we refocus efforts on poverty reduction? I don't know. I mean, it's good for human beings.
Okay, let me put that
and I elevate, I guess, human well-being over that of nature as an abstract.
All right, let me put that to our guest in the studio, James Thornton. Actually, get our priorities right. There are other priorities, poverty reduction, for example, that we should be privileging.
Well, the problem with global climate change is that it's such a serious and systemic threat to all aspects of global civilization, global infrastructure, to crops, to anything you might want to name. That in the long run, if you want to reduce poverty, which is a great idea, you're going to have to deal with climate change.
Well, let me put that back to William Yeatman. This is so all-encompassing that it needs to be addressed, climate change.
Oh, well, I mean, I guess I disagree with that catastrophic scenario. By no means is there a consensus that the outcome or that global warming is catastrophic in the end of the day. So given kind of the overwhelming odds of non-catastrophic global warming, then you start weighing benefits versus costs. And if indeed it is non-catastrophic and you're talking about costs that entail overturning the global economy, well, that exacerbates poverty problems for 2 billion people that currently live under $1 a day. So I don't think it's crazy to elevate those people's immediate well-being over that of a 3-degree temperature rise 100 years from now.
Okay, so you would, in that context then, expect Donald Trump to keep his promise to withdraw from the Paris climate deal, would you?
Well, I mean, insofar as it's an entirely voluntary agreement that was never submitted to the Senate for ratification and it carries no binding legal force, I don't see why it matters whether or not he withdraws.
Right, let me put that to James Thornton. It doesn't matter whether the US is signed up to Paris or not.
It matters a great deal. The Paris Agreement is a turning point in human history in that all the countries in the world came together agreeing that climate change was a great threat, and I would say catastrophic threat. And all the climate scientists that have any serious credentials would agree that it's a catastrophic threat. All countries agreed that we had to do something about it. Now, all countries except the United States are intending to do something about it. China wrote to Mr. Trump today to say, we are going to continue to follow the Paris Accords no matter what the United States does.
Well,
and get this.
So therefore it doesn't matter whether the US is involved or not. If China and every countries from China to Saudi are going to go ahead anyway.
You're right about Saudi. Isn't it remarkable that Saudi Arabia says we're going to do this? It's because they know it's very important. Is it important for the United States? Yes. It's still one of the largest global emitters of carbon. If it withdraws, it makes it much harder for everybody else. Everybody else is going to have to pay a much higher price, and the United States will become a free rider. Americans don't like being free riders. They like to be fair, and they would become very unfair to the rest of the world.
William Yeatman, the Paris deal needs the US.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The Paris deal needs the US.
Oh, well, again, I guess I disagree with the gentleman regarding the importance of this deal. It's legally non-binding. There's no legal responsibilities that flow from it. And with respect to other countries' tendency or ability or willingness to comply, look no further than the Kyoto Protocol. Again, that was supposedly for the countries that entered into that, and that was the precursor to the Paris Accord. Japan didn't follow its agreement. Canada didn't follow its agreement. The EU was only able to meet its commitments by virtue of the fact they adopted the Soviet-era industry and retired it all.
Well, can I appeal,
and the British dashed to gas.
Can I appeal to your wallet?
There's really been no country
Okay.
has sacrificed on behalf of one of these agreements yet, so I don't know whether the U.S. would be...
Sorry to jump in there.
I mean, again, to me it's weird there would be so much import put into this deal.
Okay, can I just jump in and just say that China is saying that the US will miss out on a whole load of new green jobs. Will that not sway the billionaire, Mr. Trump?
I mean, if you believe that, we've got a saying in the United States to express incredulity, and that is, if you believe that, then I've got a bunch of land in Florida, swampland I'd love to sell you. So yeah, this notion that there's a global green race for green energy, that's one we're well, I mean, we should lose. I mean, insofar as these industries are only a function of political favoritism, that's not the sort of business plan you want for your country. So China can have that all day.
William Yateman, James Thornton, thank you very much for joining me.
You're very
John.
Now, a man has gone on trial accused of murdering an MP because of his alleged extreme right-wing ideology. The Old Bailey has heard today Labour MP Joe Cox was shot 3 times and repeatedly stabbed in a planned and premeditated murder. 53-year-old Thomas Mayer allegedly repeatedly shouted "Britain first" as he killed Mrs Cox outside her constituency office in Birstall near Leeds in June. He denies murder. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Darshna Soni.
This is 53-year-old Thomas Mayer, a man who, a court has heard, shouted "Britain first" as he killed an MP in broad daylight a week before the EU referendum. He was a man who regularly used his local library, and it was details of the internet searches he'd made using his library card, say the prosecution, that prove he was motivated by far-right ideology. Today, the MP's parents arrived at court to hear the distressing events surrounding the death of their daughter, Jo Cox, who it's alleged was murdered in a cowardly attack by a man who disagreed with her views. The 42-year-old was the MP for Batley and Spen, widely respected for her campaigning, who, in her maiden speech in the Commons, spoke of her joy at representing a diverse community. On the day of her death, Jo Cox had visited a primary school and a care home. She then came here to this library where she held her regular surgeries for constituents. But as she got out of her car, she was attacked. She was shot 3 times and repeatedly stabbed. The court was silent as CCTV footage of the attack was played. Jo Cox was stabbed 15 times, with the wounds penetrating her heart and lungs. She was also shot 3 times. This German-manufactured rifle was later found in Thomas Mayer's bag. A number of witnesses heard him shout, "This is for Britain. Britain will always come first." It's alleged it was his ideological views that motivated him. The jury was told he'd been filmed on CCTV using the library's computers to access extremist websites. 3 days before the murder on June 13th, he accessed Jo Cox's Twitter page. He also looked up information on the Tory MP Ian Gow, the last sitting MP to be murdered before Jo Cox back in 1990. The next day, say the prosecution, he looked up material on the Nazis. He also searched for information on the Ku Klux Klan. The prosecution say he also asked whether a .22 round is deadly enough to kill with 1 shot to a human head. Thomas Mayer sat in the dock wearing a dark suit and a black tie. He occasionally took notes as the prosecution outlined their case against him. He didn't give any reaction as they described the horrific injuries that he is alleged to have inflicted on Jo Cox. The court heard that after he was arrested, he was heard to say, "I'm a political activist." The case is expected to last for 3 weeks. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News at the Old Bailey.
A man has been found guilty of murdering a policeman and dismembering his body. Stefano Brizzi strangled off-duty Met Police officer Gordon Semple after the pair met on a dating app. He admitted he was inspired by his favourite TV series, Breaking Bad, when he tried to dissolve his victim's body in a bath full of acid, high on crystal meth. Now, Channel 4 News has seen figures which highlight disturbing truths about the plight of some very vulnerable teenagers. We have an exclusive report on the number of children who simply disappear from our care system after being trafficked. We'll return to that in a moment. But first, we can reveal parliamentary figures which disclose that more than 75,000 children in England have been flagged by social workers as living in the shadow of domestic violence. I've been to meet one mother and her 2 teenage daughters whose home was broken by abuse for 8 years.
Social workers believe domestic violence plays a part in the lives of 76,000 children in this country. If anything, they caution that's likely to be an underestimate. But behind every statistic is a family. Daisy and Danielle have grown up with the memory of their mum suffering appalling violence at the hands of her former partner, their dad. For 8 years, he pushed, punched and bit her, even once attempting to strangle and stab her.
On top of the wardrobe was a bag of presents, because it was my birthday, and the kids had wrapped them up. And he just took the presents out of the bag one by one and started throwing them at me and was going, here's your birthday, have your effing birthday, as he threw them at me. And then he got the bag, the empty carrier bag, I remember it so clearly, it was orange, and walked around the bed, and I was just crouched sort of against the wall in the wardrobe, and he put the bag over my head. And I remember thinking, that's okay, I'm going to get out of this, I'm just going to poke a hole where my mouth is, because he hadn't sort of restrained my arm, so he'd put the bag over my head, and I did, that's what I did, I put my fingers through my mouth. Danielle was there, Danielle was in the kitchen, just bewildered, hanging onto my leg, and all of these things kind of happened over the course of a few days and just made me realise that actually I needed to get out. And he always used to say, the only way I'll ever leave you is in a box. And I really believed that, so it was massive. I didn't really know how I could get out of it.
Charlotte Neer's ex-partner got a 4-year prison sentence in 2010, pleading guilty to 2 counts of threat to kill and 3 of actual bodily harm. But although he's no longer involved in their lives, her children still have painful memories of their father.
When I can't remember, maybe 7, my dad used to sit with his partner in a separate room to all the children while we were eating dinner. And it was a nice roast dinner that we spent ages cooking. And we were sitting in the dining room, and then my dad was just like banging around the living room, and my oldest brother, he's 6 years older than me. He was like, okay, everyone just duck down and run through the living room. So we were running, like everyone was shielding their face, and we all ran up the stairs. And my dad's partner, she was running with us, and she was behind all of us as we were running up the stairs. And my dad threw his dinner at her while she was running up the stairs. And I just remember like gravy splatting up the walls as we ran up the stairs, and then we all hid in the bedroom.
What impact do you think all of this had on you?
I'd cry a lot actually in my room.
I didn't realise that it was affecting me until all of the stuff started happening, like when the actual trial started, and I had to have lots of different counselling and things like that, and had a bit of like OCD and things like that, and I realised like maybe I shouldn't keep all of these feelings inside of me. I was just getting so much a build up of stress.
I was very scared to tell people that he was my dad, even though it was in all the area newspapers. I still do counselling to this day. I have a lot of abandonment issues, trust issues, so basically loads of issues. But and I struggle with relationships as well. I didn't really want to go into school because I felt like people would judge me because of it. People would think that it was me, like I was who he was, when that's not the case, but that's how I was feeling at the time.
The way you've described it, it sounds like you had to behave in quite an adult way.
Yeah, very mature. We grew up quite quickly, didn't we?
Yeah, I think so.
I think you more than I did.
Yeah.
You were sort of my parent when we were staying around his.
That's why I think when it came to him actually being sentenced or whatever it was, when Mum told us about what was happening, I think that's why I was like, I'm glad it's over, whereas Danielle was more...
I was distraught about it.
Yeah.
I didn't...
Because I knew what was going on and she didn't realise as much as I did.
I just thought it was normal.
Charlotte told us she herself witnessed domestic violence as a child. So how does she feel that it's blighted her daughters' lives too?
Do you feel any sense of guilt that, you know, you're their mum and through no fault of your own, you were unable to protect them from some of what they had to witness?
I felt guilty for a very long time, and I guess the worst part of that is that, you know, I separated from him and didn't have the courage to stop him from seeing them, even though I knew in my heart that was the right thing to do. I really felt that my life would be at risk if I stopped him from seeing them. And I guess simply, yeah, I put that first, and I feel bad about that. I feel really bad. And I spent every single minute that they were with him worrying that they were going to see something they shouldn't see, and that I was not protecting them from that. And you know, I live with that. I've made my peace with that, you know, I did what I did because I thought it was the only way I could survive at the time, but I'm not proud of it.
Charlotte's former partner finishes his probation in March, and so he'll be able to contact them again. Although the family have rebuilt their lives since his imprisonment, the memory of what they've witnessed casts a long shadow.
And Charlotte, who you saw there, now works as a refugee at a refuge for women fleeing domestic violence run by the charity Women's Aid. Now, Channel 4 News can reveal tonight that the numbers of children who go missing every year from the care system after seeking asylum or being trafficked. Tomorrow, a new report will detail the scale of failings by the police and welfare agencies, with many councils unable to report how many trafficked and unaccompanied asylum-seeking children are in their care. For 19-year-old Monique, not her real name, who was trafficked into the UK at the age of 11, it was years before she got help she needed. Fatima Manji has this exclusive report and a warning: some viewers may find this report deeply upsetting.
They are the invisible children on our streets, victims of trafficking, the unaccompanied and the uncared for. Europol believes there may be 10,000 of these children across the EU. In Britain, too often those who make it into the care system are then going missing. And in some cases, they're not on the radar at all. Like this young woman whose identity we're protecting. Monique says she was just 11 when she was trafficked here from West Africa by a woman who knew her grandmother.
So your family friend says she's taking you on holiday. What happens next?
Then she took me from the village where I was staying with my granny, took me to the city. So I thought that was the holiday. So, and then a week later, I think we actually went boarding on a plane and came to England. And all I saw was a lot of white people, and I was kind of, where am I?
She was left in a London house with strangers and effectively became a slave. And then men started to visit.
The gentleman kind of pinned me down, then start exploiting me, and I start screaming and got to the point. Sometimes they use sellotape to tape my mouth, or sometimes they use like a scarf to tie my mouth up. So yeah, things became more worse from there really, that I just started bleeding.
6 months later, she managed to leave, but ended up living rough, sleeping on buses, being sexually assaulted in parks, begging for food and change. Monique then met a man who helped her, providing shelter and enrolled her in a school. But he didn't contact other authorities.
Did anyone at school ask any questions? Because you were missing school, you were acting strangely, weren't you?
Yeah. No one even questioned me or interviewed me separately. No one actually talked to me, or I find out a little bit more about me.
When she first tried to get help from social services, Monique says this is what happened.
They said, okay, who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want? They looked at me and said, where are your documents? Where's your passport? I was like, I haven't got no passport, but I've got my birth certificate, because I still had my birth certificate. So I said, I've got my birth certificate. And I showed it to the lady, and she looked at it and said, oh, sorry, we can't help you.
Even when she did make it into the system, Monique found a lack of care.
I didn't know if I should run away or if I should stay. It was really frightening and scary, really.
Monique isn't the only one. Child trafficking charity ECPAT say there's a culture of disbelief in local authorities.
That really is one of the fundamental problems that we face, is just seeing the child at first as an illegal immigrant, for example, or as a criminal if they're arrested, for example, but actually not seeing the vulnerability and the risk.
Figures seen exclusively by this programme show that in 1 year, out of nearly 5,000 unaccompanied asylum seeker children, 13% went missing. And of the 590 children identified or suspected of being trafficked into the UK, more than a quarter went missing from care. Of these, 207 hadn't been found. The Department for Education says it's already strengthened regulations and is now commissioning specialist training to help these vulnerable children. Monique is now 19. She has a partner and child of her own. But her experiences have scarred her.
I have my own family, but it still feels like I'm still relieving that fear. I don't think there will ever be time that will overcome my fear in things that I've gone through.
Fatima Manji reporting there. And if you're affected by any of the issues in either of those two films, go to channel4.com/support. New Zealand has been hit by storms and aftershocks after a powerful earthquake triggered landslides and a small tsunami. 2 people died after the 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck South Island, mostly in rural areas. Footage shows how cows stranded on an area of grass surrounded by huge landslides. Largely, the country avoided the devastation it saw 5 years ago when an earthquake struck the same region.
Over 1,600 refugees held on an offshore island off Australia are to be resettled in America. Among those kept in detention centres on Nauru and Manus Islands in extremely difficult conditions are people from Iran, from Syria, Iraq and Pakistan. The US has agreed to what it's called a one-off deal with Australia to help resolve the issue, which has cross-party support in Australia, but may not find that reciprocated in America as Donald Trump prepares for office. Our Asia correspondent Jonathan Miller has this report.
Operation Sovereign Borders built a ring of steel around Australia to keep boat people out. Would-be refugees were warehoused offshore in grim detention centres on 2 remote Pacific islands where suicides were commonplace. Last month, Amnesty International condemned conditions on the island of Nauru as tantamount to torture.
Are you not a little bit alarmed about the situation on Nauru?
Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's immigration policy was copybook Donald Trump.
Have you got anything to say about your asylum policy, Prime Minister?
Earlier this year, he refused to be drawn on his harsh and inflexible policy when challenged by Channel 4 News.
Got nothing to say, sir?
If you come to Australia illegally by boat, there is no way you will ever make Australia home.
Now, though, Australia's done a deal with Obama's outgoing administration to dump its unwanted refugees on Trump.
Morning, Peter.
Prime Minister. A golden ticket to the American dream.
The agreement is with the United States. It is a one-off agreement. It will not be repeated.
Tonight, Channel 4 News contacted incredulous asylum seekers on Nauru who couldn't believe their luck. As we exchanged texts, they said they'd been told to add their names to a list if they wanted to go to America. The guards were surprised, one said, that everyone wanted to go. No one here ever wants to go to Australia after 3 years of torture on Nauru. I never thought it would ever be possible to go to America, one young woman said. If it really is true that we can, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm counting the days before I can leave this island, another refugee said. I have forgotten how to be happy after these terrible years. Joy, though, is mixed with uncertainty. Just how many of those banished to the islands will qualify isn't clear. And then there's the prospect of the inscrutable Mr. Trump reneging on the deal, which gives the Aussies 66 days to pull it off between now and his inauguration.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
This remains the Trump position, and he's warned of what he's called the terror threat posed by refugees. Coming as most do from Muslim countries, he won't welcome this Antipodean influx. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull today dodged questions as to whether he'd even discussed the deal with Trump when they spoke on the phone last Thursday.
There's only one President of the United States at any time. Until January 20, when Donald Trump is inaugurated, the President is Barack Obama, and we deal with the one administration at a time.
Australia says its hawkish policies killed off the people smuggling racket. But Trump won't be impressed by Turnbull's people smuggling stunt, in cahoots with his co-conspirator, Obama.
Jonathan Miller reporting there.
After the break, it's eyes to the sky as the biggest moon for 70 years rises. This This is Ross on Wye Tonight. Well, tonight the moon has appeared, to those that can see it, bigger and brighter than it's been for almost 70 years. It's called a supermoon because the gap between the Earth and the moon is at its shortest point. And tonight, that distance is just over 221,500 miles. Our weather presenter, Liam Dutton, has more, and he's in central London tonight. Liam.
Thanks, John. Good evening to you. Well, it's typical, isn't it? The closest supermoon to Earth in almost 70 years, and here I am standing on the roof and the skies are shrouded with cloud. I can't see the moon at all. And the disappointing thing is that it's another 18 years until we'll get another supermoon that's equally as close, and that will take place on the 25th of November 2034. But let's just improvise, and if I could see the supermoon behind me, what would I see? Well, I'd see a moon that will probably look around 14% bigger and 30% brighter than normal. But we don't like to disappoint here on Channel 4 News. We've had our eyes on the skies across the country, and we're going to go live now to Ross on Wye in Herefordshire. And we've got an amazing view of the supermoon. It's the closest supermoon to Earth in 70 years, shining brightly and looking pretty big in the sky. And it's across Herefordshire, East Wales, Eastern Scotland and North East England, and we'll probably get the best chance of seeing this supermoon in the next couple of hours. So do go outside and have a look if you get the chance. But where else in the world has managed to see this supermoon? Our reporter, Paul McNamara, has been taking a look.
Have you had a feeling people aren't acting themselves of late? Something off in the air? Decision making turned upside down? Well, according to the ancients, you might be right, and this would be why. Big, bright and beautiful, this is a supermoon, and tonight it's as super as it's been for 7 decades. But despite its glory, it's proved trickier to catch a glimpse than you think. Cloud cover obstructed views here in Sydney. Worth the wait though, when it finally peeked through.
I think the anticipation of waiting for it for so long, for so many people, when it finally popped through the clouds, I mean, it was great. Everyone was cheering, so that was a lovely spectacle to see.
Supermoons are actually pretty common. There have already been 4 this year. But tonight's is the closest a full moon has been to Earth since 1948, making it appear 14% bigger than usual and 30% brighter. A slightly closer moon, though, also means a slightly bigger tide twinkling in the moonlight, combined with Mediterranean winds, and this is the result. Aqua alta, flooding in Venice's St. Mark's Square. Peoples the world over have told stories about the power of a full moon, from werewolves and vampires to lunar madness. That's the fiction, but as for fact, tonight the moon is a mere 221,000 miles from Earth, touching distance in astronomical terms. And while the next supermoon is in just a month, you'll have to wait until the 25th of November 2034 before a celestial sight like tonight comes around again. That's assuming, of course, you're in one of the few places in Britain tonight not cursed by cloud.
So you have to wait 18 years until you've got a supermoon this big, but if you can wait until then, it'll actually be even closer, only 221,485 miles away, so practically within spitting distance.
And tonight's top story, Donald Trump's new strategist is to be Stephen Bannon, who used to run the anti-establishment Breitbart News Network, infamous for its hard right support.
That's it for tonight. Enjoy spotting the moon if you can.
Yeah, keep looking. That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Good evening.